Okay, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you about a new line of research that I'm undertaking with a graduate student, Christopher Linebarger, who is also here at the University of North Texas. And we, in this paper, are using a new data resource on social conflict, including things such as protests, riots, low-scaled arm attacks, and really trying to ascertain the determinants of violence during periods of elections. So we have a couple of motivating questions in this line of research. First, there's good reason to believe that genuine democracy is an effective way of ameliorating or reducing the level of societal violence. Democracy is an important means of expression for people to have their political views known and aired, but the competition is more constrained, and the potential for large-scale armed violence is lower in democracy. So we know that democracy can be an important tool for conflict management, but we also know, especially in the African context, but not just in Africa, that elections are often very hotly contested and provide incentives for fraud, abuse, and violence. So we'd like to know why are some elections more violent than others. And as reports in the news recently have indicated, several elections very recently in Africa have been quite disputed and quite bloody. So the 2007 elections in Kenya, leading over into the riots of 2007 and early 2008, led to over 1,500 deaths. It led to indictments against some political leaders in the International Criminal Court. It was a very hotly contested election in which hundreds of people were killed. Fortunately, the most recent election in Kenya did not see the same level of violence, but the potential for conflict is still there. We've seen this elsewhere. This is an article from the BBC in which election violence in Nigeria left more than 500 people dead in the 2011 elections. So again, a very violent episode. But Africa does also have several positive developments and several positive stories. So Ghana in West Africa has been a model of democracy in the region since at least the mid-1990s. It's had now 6 elections that have been deemed free and fair. Yes, there have been some irregularities reported, but Ghanaians rightfully have confidence in their political institutions. We've had a meaningful alternation of power. Incumbents have lost, and it's become a model for democracy in the region. So what explains this variation? Well, first, we do know a lot of prior research has shown and has demonstrated quite convincingly that democracy is an important tool for managing conflict. Research in political science has shown that democracies tend to be more peaceful at home. They tend to be less prone to recurring instances of civil conflict and state failure. They're also more likely to be at peace with their neighbors. Democracies are more likely to respect human rights, have less corruption, and provide public services, clinics, schools, and so on, much better than the autocratic counterparts, again, on average. So we know that democracy is an important tool for conflict management, but the steps and some of the instruments of democracy can be messy at times. Now, there is some good news to report in the world. Political scientists are often criticized for sort of doom and gloom and focusing on the bad and the negative. But there have actually been some very positive trends globally. So the Center for Systemic Peace collects data on the prevalence of different forms of regimes throughout the world. So the blue line there are full-fledged democracies. The red line correspond to autocratic governments. And the black line are what we sometimes call anocracies, or governments that maybe have elections, maybe have some of the trappings of democracy, but are not fully democratic. And as we can see from the graph, after the end of the Cold War, around 1991, 1992, democracy has now become the most prevalent form of government in the world, which is again a very positive development. During the Cold War, autocracies were by far the most common form of government. But after the end of the Cold War, with the transformation of Eastern Europe and the rise of democracy in many parts of Latin America, we've seen a definite shift in that pattern. And Africa has moved in a more democratic direction. Although we have few examples of shining democracies, it is moving in a positive direction as a region. Corresponding to that, we've seen a decline in the frequency of armed conflict throughout the world, especially civil conflict, which is the line there in blue. So this is a very positive development. Conflicts in Syria, conflicts in Libya notwithstanding, we have seen a reduction in the amount of armed conflict since, again, right around the end of the Cold War. And those two trends are definitely correlated. As countries become more democratic, as democratic institutions have had time to consolidate and solidify, countries are much less prone to violence, and so we've seen this decline in the frequency of civil war. This is just another way to look at the same pattern, but to look at it geographically. This is the State Fragility Index, which measures not just full-blown civil war and state failure, but other failures of governance and lower-scale disputes. And we can see that the same regions that suffer from high state fragility, most notably Africa and the Middle East, are also the least democratic regions in the world. Which again further suggests that that democracy can be a pacifying feature. Democracy promotion has also been, as you all know, a very important component of U.S. foreign policy. One could argue that promoting democracy and human rights abroad, although the United States does have other strategic interests, but promoting democracy and human rights and serving as an example has been an important tool or important component of U.S. foreign policy for decades. We have government agencies, including the State Department Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, USAID's Agency for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, which do things like election monitoring, supporting civil society efforts, promoting the rule of law, and so on. U.S. also makes foreign aid decisions based on democratic practices in countries. So, for example, after the 2012 Mali coup, which we'll come back to toward the end of the presentation, foreign aid was cut to that country until democratic institutions were restored. We've granted diplomatic recognition to Iraq and Afghanistan after their first democratic elections, and we're quick to cede sovereignty or turn over sovereignty to those countries, provided that they had an election that was deemed free and fair. And in some parts of the world, we've intervened in ongoing armed conflicts, for example, in Libya, in order to shape those countries' political future in a more democratic direction. So again, there's been good evidence that democratic reform can help to constrain violence. As actors trade bullets for ballots, they go to the polls and compete for political power that way rather than fighting with guns. However, the focus of the international community of U.S. foreign policy, and not just the U.S., but multilateral agencies and some of our European allies and partners, has largely been on elections, on election monitoring. And we've actually been pretty good at promoting elections. We know the sort of the mechanics of how to hold polls in countries, including in very difficult environments. But democracy is not just an election. Democracy is a comprehensive set of institutions including a strong and functioning judiciary that can resolve disputes, settle constitutional matters. It involves constitutional checks on the authority of the executive, involves things such as human rights and the rule of law. And that comprehensive set of institutions is, I would argue, much more difficult to achieve than just holding elections. And there are good reasons to think that elections by themselves, absent some of these other important features and trappings of democracy, can actually do more harm than good. So elections by themselves have been known to carry some difficulties and challenges for societies, especially in fragile contexts. Elections foster and encourage the mobilization of political parties into rival political factions in which they air grievances. They are openly hostile toward each other. I mean, we have to think of our own elections in the United States and the tensions surrounding those elections as an example. It encourages political competition and also provides incentives for fraud and abuse, especially when there are not strong safeguards like independent judiciaries, like well-functioning investigative bodies for criminal investigations if that deems to be necessary. So in contexts in which institutions are weak, in which social trust is not fully established, elections can actually be quite problematic. And the challenge of elections is to convince the losers to accept the results, to bide their time, to wait until the next election, and go to the polls again, and also to convince the winners not to rig the system such that they win the elections for the foreseeable future. There are sort of numerous instances across Africa and elsewhere in which elections are held, but the same party, the same individual sometimes wins again and again and again. So how to convince the winners to play by the rules and not undermine the Constitution, and the losers to trust the results, especially in very weakly institutionalized contexts. That might be very difficult to do. So our expectation in this paper and in this research is that elections will be associated with greater social conflict. Here we're focusing on Africa, but we'd like to stress that this is not a phenomenon that's uniquely observed in Africa. I mean, even in Western elections in the United States or Europe, elections are times of heightened political competition, and fraud and abuse exists throughout the world. But here we're focusing on Africa because it is emerging in sort of democracies are starting to emerge and starting to solidify. We're seeing a turn toward elections in Africa, and we should be concerned with ensuring that those elections are free and fair and peaceful. But we also further argue that particular electoral contexts are going to be more difficult than others. And in particular, social conflict is going to be more likely when countries are either undergoing or recently recovering from a civil war. And in civil war contexts, it is very difficult for people to go to the polls and to feel safe in doing so. Rival political parties and factions lack the necessary political trust to accept defeat and to essentially put down their arms for good. The resort to arms is always a way of undermining the results of elections that are not seen as popular by one side or the other. We also argue that elections are going to be more fraught with difficulties in authoritarian settings. We've seen an increasing trend toward elections in authoritarian contexts. So these are cases like Zimbabwe or Uganda, in which elections are regularly held, but it's quite clear that the incumbent is going to win, and that the opposition is going to be harassed and perhaps faced with violence and intimidation. And also, finally, countries that are gripped by poverty and very weak institutions, very weak bureaucracies, judicial systems systems, policing systems, are not contexts that are conducive to elections. So I won't dwell on the data and methods too much. I could present more slides with the nitty-gritty of the empirical analysis, but we do conduct a regression analysis using country months as our observation. We take each month in Africa between 1990 and 2009. So each country, each month corresponds to one observation. And we count the number of social conflicts occurring within those months. So this data comes from a data project that's housed here at the University of North Texas. It's the Social Conflict in Africa database. The URL should be up on your screen. And here we count the total number of events. So these include things including protests, riots, strikes, armed attacks. But we do note that not all social conflict is necessarily bad. In particular, we would expect that during elections you would see more mass organized rallies. And some of those peaceful protests, so long as they stay peaceful, can be seen as sort of part of a healthy democracy, that people are willing to go out into the streets and to voice their concerns, to press their demands that way. So then we partition the data and we look only at violent events. So these are riots, armed attacks, things that have a more deleterious effect on society. And we also count the number of deaths within those months. Now there's been some other research on violence during elections. But they focused on the recurrence or outbreak of civil war, whereas here we're focusing on these lower level forms of conflict that in some cases, like again in Kenya, can be quite severe. So this slide might be a little bit hard to see, but this is what one record in the Social Conflict in Africa database looks like. So this is one particular event in Malawi in 1999, in which there was a riot that targeted mosques in the region of Rumfi. 5 people were killed in those riots, and the riots were directly linked to the elections in which members of one party attacked known political rivals in that case. So the Social Conflict in Africa database overall has nearly 8,000 events in it. And quite a significant share are related to elections. So a little bit more on the data. I'll breeze to this relatively quickly. Our key independent variable is the election month, which comes from the African elections database. We're focusing here in particular on executive elections. In future research, we'd like to look at legislative elections as well. But we argue that the elections for the executive branch, the president or the prime minister, are often the most hotly contested elections. So we focus on these. To operationalize civil conflict and post-conflict, we use data from Uppsala University in Sweden and the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. So we look at elections during ongoing civil wars, and we look at immediate elections in the post-conflict phase, measured by elections occurring 12 months or 24 months after the conclusion of hostilities. For democracy, we include data from the Polity Project. This is a much more comprehensive look at democratic institutions, which include factors such as how the executive is recruited, constitutional constraints on the power of the president or prime minister, the degree of political competition and participation. There are many things that are involved in polity, but it's a much wider look at democratic institutions beyond just having elections. We also have a few statistical controls for the level of wealth, the size of the country, ethnic fractionalization, and the degree to which the media actually covers those countries, because we might have spotty news coverage for some countries versus others. Okay, just a few descriptive trends before I get into the regression results. This is a look at all conflicts in Africa, whether or not they're election related. So those are the blue bars. And then the red line are conflicts that are related to elections in one way or the other. So in the social conflict in Africa database, we note up to 3 issue areas that underlie or are underpinning the event. And one of those issue areas are elections. So overall, about 9% of all of the conflicts in the data set are related in some form or another to elections. These might be conflicts leading up to the elections between political parties, but they could also be riots or attacks after the election if those elections are disputed. And it's kind of hard to see from the red line just the scale of how things are drawn. But elections have been slightly increasing as a issue area underpinning violence over time. So there's a slight upward trend over time, in addition to the overall pattern. These are the 10 most violent election months. Now, these only record deaths that occurred during the election month itself, so it doesn't really account for conflicts leading up to the elections. Kenya, the 2007 elections are by far the most violent conflicts if we just look at the immediate electoral violence. The elections in South Africa in 1994 were also marked by quite a bit of violence, although throughout 1994 and 1995, there were armed attacks between the African National Congress and the Inkatha Freedom Party, which led to thousands of deaths, which they weren't particularly tied to any one election, but were part of ongoing political competition as South Africa was moving toward a more democratic system. And we've had election-related violence throughout the continent. And then finally, this slide shows just descriptively the frequency of elections in democratic and non-democratic contexts. So the columns refer to whether or not an election is held at all, whereas the row looks at whether the country was ranked by that polity index as being a full-fledged democracy or not. And this is the row to focus on here. So in the over the time period in which we're looking, there were about 144 executive elections across the African continent. 92 of those, so a majority, actually almost 2/3 of all elections in Africa occurred in non-democratic settings. So these are, for example, the conflicts, the elections in Zimbabwe, the elections in Uganda, the elections in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in which the country can hardly be said to be a democracy, yet they hold elections anyway. If you actually look at the trend over time, these authoritarian elections are becoming more and more frequent. Particularly during the Cold War, autocrats didn't even pay lip service to democracy. But now, especially with conditions on foreign aid coming from the United States, from Europeans and others, even autocratic systems are holding elections in order to sort of at least pay lip service to the rules of the game. Okay, and then this presents our regression results. I'm not going to present any regression tables, but just give you the substantive findings here. So the y-axis there looks at the observed frequency of events according to a baseline. So if we just when there are elections, which again could be largely nonviolence. In some contexts, it certainly is, but we see a doubling in the frequency of armed conflict. Then, if we look at violent events, the frequency of violent events increases by about 2.5 times, while the frequency of deaths increases 3-fold during those periods of conflict. So some bad news and some good news when we unpack the data a little bit further. So, bad but not expected is that elections during civil conflict, so this is when a civil war is ongoing, they tend to be more conflict prone. And these are not infrequent in Africa. So we've had elections during ongoing violence in Angola, Chad, Ethiopia, Senegal, Uganda. So in these contexts in which at least part of the country is involved in a civil war are probably the worst contexts in which to hold elections, and the frequency of violence increases quite dramatically as opposed to the non-conflict situations. Relatively poor countries, and especially those countries that lack just basic bureaucratic capacity, just the basic technical proficiency to hold polls, experience far more conflict as well. Now, some good news, we actually didn't find that post-conflict elections, so these are elections that occur within 12 or 24 months, depending on how you measure it, it didn't lead to any significant increase in violence. We have to sort of do a little bit more research to ascertain why, but my initial hunch is that there might be a strong monitoring effect in those elections. So typically, these peace accords are accompanied by a UN or AU peacekeeping force, quite a bit of international scrutiny and aid, and it might be the case that this international attention and the presence of peacekeepers can actually dampen conflict during those very fragile post-conflict months. And then probably most importantly, the elections that occur in genuine democracies, in democracies that that meet the standard of democratic institutions as measured by the Polity Index, cuts the conflict risk approximately in half. So democracy actually does work. Here are some additional preliminary findings. Again, this shouldn't be any surprise, so I'll just breeze through this relatively quickly. Very close elections tend to be more conflict prone. These are elections in which the margin of victory is quite narrow. Allegations of electoral fraud and banning of opposition parties. So again, these undemocratic practices during elections tend to be associated with more conflict. So in conclusion, and then I do want to talk a little bit about policy implications for Mali and use that to generate some discussion. I would argue, and we would argue from this research, that the international community shouldn't be pushing for elections prior to the establishment of other democratic state safeguards. So elections that occur in authoritarian settings, authoritarian elections, are probably the worst scenario in which to hold elections. So rather than pushing countries toward elections in which we know the outcome is going to be rigged, in which we know that the incumbent has little chance of losing, in which the media is tightly controlled and censored, just pushing for elections can actually do more harm than good. And what the international community should be doing is stressing more meaningful constitutional reforms prior to having those initial elections. Secondly, elections can be a tool for resolving civil war, but they should be pursued only after pursuing some sort of a peace settlement. So having elections during ongoing conflict is unqualifiedly bad. So we should push for peace settlements in which all actors have come to the table, laid down their arms, and agreed on a framework for having those first elections, perhaps with some international monitoring. So I'm going to just turn to Mali a little bit. I'm going to give you a few quotes from news around this. So most of you are probably familiar with what's happened in Mali over the last 12 to 24 months or so. But Mali for decades has experienced an insurgency in the north involving the Tuareg ethnic group. That insurgency really became much more heated after Libya collapsed and arms flowed into the northern regions of Mali. In March of last year, there was a coup in which the military overthrew the democratically elected government of Mali over their handling of the insurgency. And subsequently, the United States and many of our Western allies cut off aid to the government, saying that assistance would only resume when the country's democratic government is restored. So that's there in the first quote. And in the meantime, Mali has continued to face an insurgency in which armed elements, some of which are affiliated with Al-Qaeda, have been fighting in the north. There was a French intervention force that is going to be backed by an AU, an ECOWAS intervention force as well. But the country is moving toward democratic elections. So the government is committed to having elections on July 28th. A lot of that is tied to expectations of foreign aid to be reopened after the elections are held. But the country is still far from secure, and there still is no peace agreement between the North and the South. So very recently, just a few days ago, the Obama administration indicated that it would ask for aid to be reestablished to Mali, but only after the elections are held. And then ominously, this last quote indicates that the Tuareg separatists dismissed French calls to disarm ahead of the elections, saying that they will fight to the death if Malian troops entered its area. So we still have an ongoing conflict. We still don't have a strong or a clear indication that the Tuareg insurgency has come to an end, but we're having elections in July anyway. So the questions that I'd honestly be interested to hear some of your thoughts on have to do with what is the balance between democracy and other strategic interests that we have in Mali. We clearly have interests in going after Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other extremist groups operating in the north. Should elections be a precondition for working with Mali at all, as they challenge violent extremism in the north? Should we be pushing for elections prior to the settlement of the conflict between the north and the south? If we have democratic elections under the old constitution, there's no guarantee that the Tuareg insurgency and the groups in the north with legitimate grievances against the government will put down their guns. And then finally, should the U.S. and its allies focus on elections alone, or are there other benchmarks that we would insist upon before establishing diplomatic relations and turning back on the aid spigot to Mali? So those are open questions. I think there's a lot of policy debate and speculation about all of these issues. But I think with that, I will leave it and take your questions about our research, and then perhaps a more general discussion about what to do with the situation in Mali. So I thank you all for your attention. I'm sorry if I ran over time a little bit, but I do look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salehyan. As folks are getting their questions together to type into the chat box down below, we have some already that I'd like to ask you, a little bit out of order, and I apologize for that. One question from Yuna Wong. In regards to the slide, I believe it's the additional findings slide, how confident are you that those findings are causal? Yeah, that's the one that I think we're talking about.
So these particular variables come from the NELDA data set. So this is collected by Susan Hyde at Yale University. So in terms of causality, I mean, causality is very difficult to unpack here. So allegations of electoral fraud, yes, they tend to occur, right during the election. But what we can do is unpack the exact timing of when violence is occurring. And this is certain things that we're sort of exploring this in a follow-up paper to this. Are we more likely to see violence and conflict at certain key periods of the election process. So, for example, as parties are registering, as you get bans on political parties, as elections occur or are underway, and then if they're certified as free and fair or occurring with some irregularities. So one thing that we could look to unpack causality is to look at the sequence of violence, and not just sort of what we've done here is to look at all electoral violence in sort of an aggregated way. But one thing that we're looking at as a follow-up to this research is to actually look at the timing of these events. So if we have a charge of electoral fraud by an opposition party, does that lead to future violence? If international monitors declare the election to be fraudulent, does violence occur shortly thereafter? And then we're able to sort of unpack the causal chain. But regardless of whether the causal arrow goes from, say, fraud to violence or vice versa, the correlation itself is important, because we know that there's an association between these two variables, these two factors, and regardless of which way the causal arrow runs, we know we can do something about making sure that the electoral process is transparent and free and fair, in anticipation of things that might come if opposition parties are banned and so on and so forth. So I think that the correlational evidence is important in and of itself, and in future research, as we look at the exact timing of conflict, we can really ascertain the direction of the cause.
Okay, thank you very much. And as long as we're on elections, there's a question and a bit of an opinion from Dr. Clara Metellus. She asks, says, have you seen examples of elections as a measure of democracy more in U.S. government institutions or others? For example, she says, we've seen several DoD-affiliated institutions write about the stability of Mali and the positive nature of the regime as recent as 2010. Seems that something missed in that. And she comments that elections, in her opinion, should not be a precondition for working with a country, because cutting off aid makes resources decrease, and it just complicates the situation a lot more. And setting up institutions and legitimacy of elections, do you want that to be a precondition? What do you think?
Well, I mean, my sense is that folks in the U.S. government are sensitive to these issues, that democracy is more than just having elections. Actually, some of the data that I was using by the Polity Project is used by the CIA and USAID and some of their fragility and assessments. So we have a sense that democracy is more than just elections. My fear is that especially in Congress and in the executive branch, at times there's an incentive to just use elections as a shorthand. We have other interests, like take Mali, for example. We have other interests there, like going after Islamic extremists. So those interests are there. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we had interests in various interests in those contexts as well. My fear is, what often happens is we know that democracy has these other institutional elements, but we use elections as a convenient shorthand to then tell the American public that, well, we're doing business with these countries, but it's okay because they're democratic, and sort of using that as a signal that we can begin giving aid, we can begin giving counterinsurgency training, we can begin having diplomatic ties and recognition, simply because we've had an election. And I think that can be, in the long run, counterproductive if we're not pushing for some of the other democratic reforms that are so very, very important. So that's a little bit of a cynical view of why there might be political incentives to just use elections as a shorthand. but it's one that I think that we've seen in various contexts. And this is not just a recent phenomenon, but if we went back to the 70s and 80s during the Cold War, we would often encourage our allies in developing countries, particularly in Latin America, to just hold elections regardless of allegations of fraud, abuse, harassment, and so on, but just hold those elections so that we can go back to Congress and justify some of our foreign policy decisions. So again, it's a little bit of a cynical view, and I understand why there are these competing interests at stake, but it's one that it's a line that we should be very careful about as we craft foreign policy toward particular countries.
Exactly, and I think that's what with the question previously about the causality of these findings, and it goes on to say if you don't distinguish between there's a correlation but not causation, that they're going to be ineffective as policy recommendations. Is that consistent?
I mean, well, we should be challenging fraud regardless. I mean, regardless of whether fraud or banning parties or harassing the opposition leads to conflict or not, from a policy perspective, we should be encouraging countries not to engage in fraud or abuse or harassment because they're proper policies in and of themselves. So we know that free and fair elections are transparent, that occur in institutional environments that are more transparent and open and democratic, are better than authoritarian elections, and regardless of whether or not they foster conflict and violence, we should be pursuing free and fair and transparent elections on their own merits. So I think there's no ambiguity about what the policy implication here is.
Sure. Okay, and that kind of gets around to another question this one by Dr. Okonafua. Sorry about that, I butchered the name, I apologize. Do you see a parallel between resource conflict and elections conflict in Africa? In the sense, the presence of lootable resources engenders violence, and political power is increasingly a lootable resource. Have you seen this, or what do you think about that?
It's not something that we've looked at directly in this paper, in this piece, but anecdotally, I can say that control of resources often underpin some of this heated electoral competition. So in context, for example, in Nigeria, in which there's ongoing tension between the oil-producing South and the North. Elections and ensuring that your favored political party or candidate is in power is often about how oil revenues or revenues from other natural resources are distributed. Now, whether that exacerbates electoral violence, provides more incentives for fraud and abuse, it's not something we've looked at directly, but I think there are good reasons to think that in contexts in which the distribution of resources is really at issue and has perhaps fueled civil conflict, civil war in the past, those types of arrangements for revenue sharing and so on are critical. We see this not just in Africa, but also in contexts such as Iraq, in which one of the key political questions is how to divide the oil revenues between various communities, and although there might be sort of the trappings of democracy there, the stakes are potentially much higher when resource allocation schemes are very hotly contested, and it's not clear who has the rights to the mineral resources under the soil.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So, Dr. Salehyan, do you have some closing thoughts? What would be the one big takeaway that we can get from your presentation here today?
I think most importantly is is elections short of other democratic institutions is actually counterproductive. That we shouldn't be, as a policy community, as a, most of you folks are working in some foreign policy arena, that just calling for elections and pushing countries to have elections can actually be worse than having no elections at all, provided that other democratic safeguards are not in place. So in context, for example, just to use the Mali example again, is, I would argue that it's more important to have a peace settlement between the Tuaregs and the government in the south, to have a meaningful constitutional reform in which the parties are satisfied with the terms, and then have an election in the context of relative peace and stability. Now, we've too often seen elections in Africa and elsewhere that occur in the midst of ongoing conflict without appropriate democratic safeguards. And those can actually be counterproductive, and we should be very wary about jumping to those, as a policy community. So, so I think that would be the most important take-home message of this research and of other research that's coming down the pipeline.
Great, thank you so much. And